My brothers stripped the coat from my back before they threw me into the pit. I screamed until my throat gave out. I kept waiting for one of them, just one, to say my name like a brother again. None of them did. The last thing I saw before they sold me was my own blood walking away. That was Joseph, 17 years old, sold by his own family for 20 pieces of silver. Not a stranger's cruelty, his brother's. The kind of wound that doesn't just bruise the body, it rewrites who you think you can trust for the rest of your life. This is the story of a boy betrayed by blood, enslaved, imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, and a man he became when he finally held power over the very people who destroyed him. The question is, when you finally have the chance to make someone pay for what they did to you, what do you do with that power? What does it cost a person to survive being thrown away by their own family? Not strangers, not enemies, but the people who were supposed to protect them most. What happens to a person's faith in God, in people, in themselves, when every door that should open instead slams shut? When the very thing that should save you becomes the thing that gets you punished? And when a moment finally comes, years later, after everything, when the people who destroyed your life are standing in front of you, powerless, and you hold every card, what does mercy even look like after that much loss? This is a story about a coat, about a pit, about 14 years stolen from a man's life by people who should have loved him. But underneath all of that, it's a story about something every person watching this has wrestled with in their own life, in their own way. What do you do with the people who hurt you when you finally have the power to do anything you want to them? Stay with this one, because by the end, you might find yourself thinking about someone in your own life, someone who hurt you, someone you've never quite forgiven, someone you've been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it's become. To understand how deep this wound went, you have to understand what Joseph's life looked like before any of it happened. He was the 11th of 12 sons, born to a man named Jacob, a man with a complicated, exhausting family history of his own, full of rivalry and deception that had shaped every relationship in that household long before Joseph was born. Jacob had two wives, Leah and Rachel was the one he loved most. Joseph was her son, and Rachel had died, giving birth to Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin, leaving Jacob with two sons from the woman he'd loved best, in a house full of sons from women he hadn't loved the same way. You can probably already feel where this is going. Jacob held on to Joseph the way people hold on to things they're terrified of losing twice. Joseph wasn't just a son to him. He was a living piece of Rachel, a reminder of the love Jacob had lost, and Jacob poured that grief and love into Joseph in ways the other 10 brothers couldn't help but notice. And then Jacob did something that on the surface looked like a small gesture. He gave Joseph a coat, a richly ornamented robe, the kind of garment given to someone set apart, someone important, someone chosen. To Jacob, it was an expression of love. He probably didn't think twice about it. But to the 10 older brothers, watching their father drape that coat over their youngest sibling's shoulders, it wasn't a gift. It was a verdict. It said in fabric and color and craftsmanship exactly what they had probably suspected for years. You are less than him. You have always been less than him. If you've ever grown up in a family where one sibling seemed to get something the rest of you didn't, more attention, more trust, more grace, more forgiveness, you already know the slow poison that creates. It doesn't usually explode right away. It sits, it simmers, It becomes the quiet resentment underneath every family dinner, every shared chore, every moment the favored child gets praised for something the others did just as well and were never noticed for. Joseph, for his part, seems to have had no idea any of this was happening. He was 17. He was his father's favorite, and he had grown up inside that favor the way a fish grows up inside water, without ever really seeing it, because it was simply the environment he'd always known. And then Joseph started having dreams. Strange, vivid dreams, the kind that feel less like dreams and more like messages. In one, he dreamed that he and his brothers were out in the field binding sheaves of wheat, and his sheaf stood upright while all of his brothers' sheaves gathered around it and bowed down. In another, he dreamed of the sun, the moon, and 11 stars all bowing down to him. And here's the part that matters most. Joseph told them. He told his brothers about the dream where their sheaves bowed to his. And then, perhaps not understanding yet how much damage had already been done, he told them the second dream too, the one where even the sun and moon bowed to him. He even told his father, who, even in his evident love for Joseph, rebuked him for it. Though Jacob also seems to have quietly turned the dream over in his mind, wondering. His brothers, understandably, did not receive this well. The text doesn't soften it. It says plainly that they hated him for it, that they couldn't even speak a kind word to him anymore. Looking back, this is the part of the story that feels almost unbearably human. Joseph wasn't lying. He wasn't manipulating anyone. He was a teenager who had a series of dreams that felt important, and he did what teenagers, what most people, do with something that feels important. He told the people closest to him. He just didn't yet understand that some truths, even true ones, land very differently depending on who's already primed to hear them as an attack. The first sign looked like nothing. A coat, a few dreams shared too freely. A father's favoritism that had been quietly accumulating for years before Joseph was even old enough to notice it. That's why no one thought to intervene. That's why no one saw what was coming. One day, Jacob sent Joseph out to find his brothers. They had taken the flocks to graze near Shechem, then moved on to Dothan, a fair distance from home, and Jacob wanted to know they were safe. So Joseph put on the coat, and he went. His brothers saw him coming from a distance. That coat, the one symbol of everything they resented, was visible long before Joseph's face was. And something in them that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. Some of them wanted to kill him, not as a metaphor. They discussed actually killing him, throwing his body into a pit, and telling their father a wild animal had gotten him. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. These were not strangers plotting against an enemy. These were brothers, men who had grown up beside Joseph, who had eaten at the same table, who shared the same father, standing in a field, discussing how to end his life and what lie they'd tell afterward. It was Reuben, the eldest, who intervened, though even his intervention is complicated. He convinced the others not to kill Joseph directly, suggesting instead that they throw him into a pit and leave him there. Some readings suggest Reuben may have intended to come back later and rescue Joseph quietly, restoring him to their father without anyone else knowing. If that's true, it didn't work out that way. So they did it. They grabbed Joseph, their own brother, stripped the ornamented coat from his body, and threw him into an empty cistern, a deep pit dug into the ground, likely dry, likely dark, likely far enough from any road that no one passing by would hear him. And then, this is the detail that, more than almost anything else in this story, reveals exactly how far things had gone. They sat down and ate a meal, while Joseph was below them in the dark, screaming, begging, pleading with the only family he had to pull him back out. His brothers sat in the field above him and ate, together, as if nothing unusual was happening, as if the sound coming from beneath their feet wasn't the voice of someone they'd shared childhood with. If you've ever experienced a betrayal from people close to you, not strangers, but people who were supposed to be on your side, you might recognize something in that detail. It's rarely the betrayal itself that cuts the deepest. It's the casualness of it. The way the people who hurt you seem to move on so easily, so quickly, as if your pain barely registers as an inconvenience to their afternoon. While they were eating, a caravan passed by, traders heading toward Egypt. And it was Judah, according to the account, who saw an opportunity. Why kill their brother, risking the guilt of bloodshed, when they could simply sell him? Get rid of him permanently, profit from it, and never have to look at his face again. So they pulled Joseph up from a pit, not to free him, to sell him. 20 pieces of silver, the going rate at the time for a slave. The traders bound him, and the caravan continued on toward Egypt, carrying a 17-year-old boy in chains, away from everything and everyone he had ever known. But the brothers weren't finished. They still had to deal with their father. They took the coat, the same coat that had marked Joseph as different, as chosen, as loved, and they killed a goat, and they dipped that coat in its blood. Then they carried it home to Jacob, presented it to him, and let him draw his own conclusion. A wild animal must have killed Joseph and torn him apart. Jacob's reaction wasn't just grief. The text describes him tearing his clothes, a traditional act of mourning, and refusing every attempt at comfort from his remaining sons and daughters. He said he would mourn his son until the day he joined him in death. For years, Jacob believed Joseph was dead, torn apart by a wild animal, and he carried that grief, that specific, false grief, built entirely on a lie his own sons had constructed for what would become decades. And meanwhile, in a caravan crossing the desert toward Egypt, in chains, surrounded by people speaking a language he likely didn't understand, heading toward a country he'd never seen, Joseph sat with a single devastating truth. The people who did this to him weren't strangers. They weren't enemies from some rival tribe. They were his brothers. The only family he had left in the world were the people responsible for taking everything from him. After that, nothing could go back to what it was. Not for Joseph, not for Jacob, not for any of them, though only Joseph and his brothers knew it yet. In Egypt, Joseph was sold again, this time to a man named Potiphar, an official in Pharaoh's court, the captain of the guard. And here's where the story takes a turn that's easy to rush past, but shouldn't be. Joseph didn't fall apart. He was a slave in a foreign country, having just been betrayed by his own family in the worst way imaginable. And yet, the account tells us that Joseph found favor in his master's household. He rose. Potiphar began trusting him with more and more responsibility, eventually putting Joseph in charge of everything he owned. This matters because it tells us something about who Joseph was underneath all of it. He had every reason to become bitter, withdrawn, hollowed out by what had happened to him. Betrayal at that level. by your own family, no less, could easily have turned him into someone who trusted no one, who gave up, who simply existed rather than lived. Instead, he showed up. He worked. He built something, even in circumstances that have been forced on him by people who claim to love him. If you've ever had to keep functioning, keep working, keep showing up for your life, while carrying something devastating underneath the surface, you understand how much strength that actually takes. It doesn't look like strength from the outside. It just looks like someone doing their job. But underneath, it's one of the hardest things a person can do. And then, just as things seemed to be stabilizing, it happened again. Potiphar's wife took notice of Joseph, and when he refused her advances, refused again and again, she turned her humiliation into an accusation. She told her husband that Joseph had attacked her, and Potiphar, believing his wife, had Joseph thrown into prison. Let that sink in for a moment. Joseph had already lost his family, his home, his freedom, and his identity. And now, for doing the right thing, for refusing to betray his master's trust, for maintaining his integrity in a situation where almost no one would have known if he hadn't, he was punished as if he'd done the opposite. He was thrown into prison for a crime that existed only in someone else's lie. And he stayed there, not for weeks, not for months. The account makes clear that years passed. Joseph sat in that Egyptian prison for what would become a significant portion of his young adulthood, with no trial, no release date, seemingly no one coming for him. There's a particular kind of pain in that. It's one thing to suffer because of something you did. It's another thing entirely to suffer because of something someone else did to you. And to know that the people who could clear your name either don't know, don't care, or have simply moved on with their lives while you remain frozen in the consequences of their choices. At one point, while in prison, Joseph interpreted dreams for two of Pharaoh's officials who had been imprisoned alongside him, a cupbearer and a baker. He told the cupbearer his dream meant he would be restored to his position within 3 days. He asked the man, when that happened, to remember him, to mention his case to Pharaoh, to help get him out. The cupbearer was restored, exactly as Joseph said. And then, nothing. The text tells us plainly, the cupbearer forgot him. 2 more years passed. This is the part of Joseph's story that doesn't get talked about enough, because it's not dramatic in the way betrayal or imprisonment is dramatic. It's quiet. It's the kind of pain that doesn't have a single moment you can point to, just years accumulating while you wait for something that may never come. It's hope extended and then withdrawn over and over until you're not sure if hoping is even worth the cost anymore. Here's what this part of Joseph's story holds for anyone who has lived through injustice they couldn't control, or waiting they couldn't shorten, or a wrong that no one else seemed to notice or care about. Betrayal doesn't end with the act itself. It echoes. It echoes in every room you're forced into afterward, in every person who doesn't believe you, or doesn't ask, or simply forgets. In every year that passes with no vindication, no apology, no acknowledgement that something was taken from you that should never have been. Some stories do not resolve quickly. They settle into something you carry while you keep living anyway, going to work, doing your job, getting up the next day, even when no one around you understands what you're carrying or why it's so heavy. And here's the truth at the center of this entire chapter of Joseph's life. The bravest thing he did wasn't surviving the pit, or surviving slavery, or even surviving years of wrongful imprisonment. It was staying himself through all of it. Staying capable of integrity when no one was watching. Staying capable of skill and diligence when there was no reward in sight. Staying, somehow, capable of kindness. Interpreting a stranger's dream with care, even while sitting in the same prison cell, even while his own situation remained unresolved. Most transformations don't look like strength from the inside. They look like surviving one more day, and then another, and then somehow years of those days stacked one on top of the other, until one day, for reasons Joseph could not have predicted or controlled, everything changed. 2 years after the cupbearer forgot him, Pharaoh himself had a dream. Actually, 2 dreams that none of his wise men or magicians could interpret. And finally, the cupbearer remembered. He told Pharaoh about a Hebrew prisoner who had once interpreted his dream with perfect accuracy. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh, pulled in a single day from a forgotten prison cell to standing in front of the most powerful man in Egypt. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams as a warning. 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. And then he didn't just interpret the dream. He proposed a plan to prepare for it. Pharaoh was so impressed that he did something almost unthinkable. He took Joseph, a foreign-born slave, a convicted prisoner, and made him the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, overseeing the entire plan to save the nation from famine. Years later, that famine reached Canaan too, Joseph's homeland, and his brothers, the same men who had thrown him into a pit and sold him for silver, traveled to Egypt to buy grain, because their families were starving. They stood in front of Joseph. They didn't recognize him. Why would they? The boy they'd sold was now a powerful Egyptian official, dressed, speaking, living an entirely different life. But Joseph recognized them immediately. And here is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Joseph held, in that moment, absolute power over the people who had destroyed his life. He could have done anything. Imprison them. Enslave them the way they'd enslaved him. Let them starve the way they'd let him scream in that pit while they ate. Instead, he wept. He told them who he was. And then he said something that reframes the entire story. What you intended for harm became the means by which our family and many others were saved. That coat, the one that marked Joseph as different, the one that became the prop in a lie that broke his father's heart for decades, became, in the end, part of the path that led Joseph to the one position in the world where he could save the very people who had taken everything from him. Some stories end. Some just become part of who you are. The chapters of your life that hurt the most, the betrayals, the years that felt wasted, the silence from people who should have spoken up. Those are often the very things that, much later, you understand differently. Not because the pain wasn't real. It was, but because it wasn't the whole story. If a betrayal, a loss, or a long stretch of waiting has stayed with you longer than it should have, what do you think it was trying to show you that you weren't ready to understand yet? So tell me, if you've ever been betrayed by someone close to you, by someone who was supposed to be on your side, and years later found yourself in a position to respond with either revenge or grace, what did you choose? And looking back now, do you think you chose right? I'd really like to know. Leave in the comments. I read everyone. In the next story, I'm exploring a moment that looked like an ending until it revealed itself as the only real beginning. If stories like this once stay with you, you know what to do.